So we talked in the last video about parallelograms, and now we're going to talk about converses of those parallelogram theorems, or the reverses of those theorems. So let's review the few things we do know. We do know a bunch of parallelogram properties. So we know that the opposite sides are parallel. We know that the opposite sides are also congruent. Consecutive angles are supplementary. Opposite angles are congruent. And that the diagonals bisect each other. And that diagram, if you remember, came off the last video. So we now have the reverses of those theorems and those properties that we know about parallelograms. We use these theorems to prove that quadrilaterals are parallelograms. So now we can say that if these properties occur and it's a four-sided figure, we know it's a parallelogram. So the first converse is of theorem 6.3. It says that if both pairs of opposite sides of a quadrilateral are congruent, then it is a parallelogram. So if we know the opposite sides are congruent, we know the shape is a parallelogram. Converse of theorem 6.4 says if an angle of a quadrilateral is supplementary to both of its consecutive angles, then the quadrilateral is a parallelogram. So again, if we know that A plus B adds to 180, we know the shape is a parallelogram. Converse of theorem 6.5 says if both pairs of opposite angles of a quadrilateral are congruent, then the quadrilateral is a parallelogram. So if we know that the opposite angles are congruent, we also know it's a parallelogram. And last but not least, if the diagonals of a quadrilateral bisect each other, then the quadrilateral is a parallelogram. So if the diagonals cut each other in half, we know we have a parallelogram. And then there's one final theorem. It says if one pair of opposite sides of a quadrilateral is both congruent and parallel, the quadrilateral is a parallelogram. So we know that if opposite sides are parallel, or if opposite sides are congruent, we have a parallelogram. Well, if one set is one of each, it's both congruent and parallel, we also know the shape is a parallelogram. So that was a lot of information. So let's review what we know. We know these properties of a parallelogram. The opposite sides are parallel, the opposite sides are congruent, consecutive angles are supplementary, opposite angles are congruent, and the diagonals bisect each other. We can prove that a quadrilateral is a parallelogram by looking at the reverses of these. If the opposite sides are congruent, it's a parallelogram. If the consecutive angles are supplementary, it's a parallelogram. If the opposite angles are congruent, it's a parallelogram. If the diagonals bisect each other, it's a parallelogram. And then lastly, if a pair of opposite sides are both parallel and congruent, it's a parallelogram. That's a lot of information. Go back and review that previous slide and make sure you know all those properties and all those ways to prove congruent. And that's it for our video. We will see you in class.